Target length, about 2,100 words. Video duration, about 10 minutes. Date context, April 2026. News anchors, same source, different angle. Temporal mismatch thesis. Narrative versus functional asset divide. Integration, not disruption. 36 trillion sovereign debt innovation cycle. Bridge asset architecture. Ripple Prime as infrastructure positioning. OTC accumulation invisible to price. Regulatory clarity as capital release valve. Tokenization movement layer. Repricing is immediate, not gradual. Huck style. Time horizon mismatch as the hidden variable. The retail investor and the institutional investor are looking at the same asset, with clocks running at completely different speeds. That gap, not price, not FUD, not regulation, is the mechanism that transfers wealth from one group to the other. Every cycle, without exception. There is a wealth transfer happening right now in the XRP market. Not from bulls to bears, not from retail to institutions, not from crypto to traditional finance. From people watching the wrong clock to people watching the right one. Here is what I mean. The retail investor refreshing XRP's price chart is operating on a daily time horizon. Each candle matters. Each percentage move produces an emotional response. An 8% drop feels like a crisis. A 10% gain feels like validation. The institutional investor building XRP exposure through prime brokerage infrastructure, over-the-counter transactions, and long-term allocation schedules is operating on a cycle time horizon. Individual days are irrelevant. Individual percentage moves are noise. What matters is where the asset will be when the system is fully built, not where it is while the building is still underway. Two groups, same asset, completely different clocks. And here is the part that should stop you cold. In every major asset repricing in financial history, the group running on the shorter clock exits or never enters, right before the group running on the longer clock is proven right. Right now, that dynamic is playing out with a precision that is almost mathematical. Retail investors have been panic selling XRP on 8% drops, exits driven by daily price action, while institutions have been quietly assembling the most comprehensive digital asset infrastructure ever built around a single asset class. Prime brokerage, custody solutions, payment rail integrations, regulatory approvals, over-the-counter accumulation that never touches public exchange order books. None of that infrastructure shows up on a daily price chart. None of it is visible to someone running on a daily clock. But it is completely, unmistakably visible to anyone running on a cycle clock. And the gap between what the daily clock shows and what the cycle clock shows is the largest it has been since the early institutional positioning phases that preceded every major market repricing in the past decade. So here is the question that this temporal mismatch forces. If retail investors are exiting based on daily price action, and institutional investors are building based on cycle-level infrastructure development, who is accumulating the supply that retail is selling? And what happens to the daily price chart when the cycle-level event that institutional investors have been positioning for finally arrives, and retail scrambles to get back in? Welcome to XRP News Flow Signals, where we run on the cycle clock, not the daily chart. This is not financial advice. Always do your own research. But if you want to understand why the temporal mismatch between retail and institutional time horizons is the most important variable in XRP's market right now, more important than any single news event, any price level, any sentiment indicator, stay with me. We map the structure, not the noise. Let's start with the structural shift that is currently separating the digital asset market into two fundamentally different categories and understand why that separation is the most important thing happening in crypto right now. We are entering a phase where the market differentiates between narrative assets and functional assets. Narrative assets derive their value from perception, from community belief, from the strength of a story told compellingly enough that enough people agree it has value. They thrive in retail-driven market phases, where sentiment, social media momentum, and FOMO cycles drive price action. Functional assets derive their value from usage, from the real economic activity flowing through them, from the infrastructure decisions made by entities that do not trade on narrative. They trade on settlement requirements, compliance frameworks, and operational efficiency. As the global financial system transitions toward tokenized, programmable infrastructure, the dominant driver of digital asset value is shifting from narrative to function. This is not a subtle shift. It is a categorical one. And XRP sits in an unusual position within it. XRP has always had a narrative, and that narrative has been contested, attacked, and litigated for years. The SEC lawsuit, the banking coin characterization, the centralization debate. These are narrative battles, and they have influenced retail sentiment significantly. But underneath those narrative battles, a functional reality has been building without pause. Settlement in 3 to 5 seconds, transaction fees in fractions of a cent, compatibility with ISO 2022, the financial messaging standard being adopted across global banking infrastructure. Ripple Prime's integration with DTCC and CME clearing systems. Treasury's $13 trillion in annual commercial payment volume waiting for XRP migration. The narrative was contested. The function was never in question. And as the market transitions from narrative-driven to function-driven pricing, the asset whose narrative was most attacked, but whose function was most proven, stands to experience the largest repricing relative to its current valuation. But here is the part that most cycles analysis gets wrong. It focuses on when the repricing happens, what price level, what catalyst date, what legislative trigger. And while those questions matter, they miss the more important question. How does the repricing happen? Is it gradual? Is it sudden? Is it a single event or a sequence? The answer to that question determines everything about positioning, and it is not what most retail investors assume. Let me show you the mechanics. Let's talk about how major asset repricings actually occur at the structural level, because retail intuition about this is almost always wrong. The retail model of repricing, asset goes up gradually as more people discover it. Early adopters make the most. Late adopters make less. The price chart is a smooth curve upward over time. The institutional model of repricing, asset sits in accumulation for an extended period, often with price stability or mild suppression as large capital builds positions. Then a specific trigger fires, a regulatory change, a major institutional announcement, a sovereign adoption event, and price reprices rapidly to a new level that reflects the accumulated institutional conviction. The repricing is not gradual, it is immediate. And by the time it is visible to daily chart watchers, the positioning phase is complete. Here is why this distinction matters for XRP specifically. The accumulation phase we are currently in has several documented signatures. Exchange reserves at 8-year lows. Tokens moving off public exchanges into custody wallets, ETF holdings, and OTC settlements. Systematically, continuously, invisibly to price chart observers. OTC institutional accumulation. Transactions structured specifically to avoid public exchange price impact. Large capital building positions without showing up in the daily price action. Infrastructure integration. Ripple Prime's DTCC membership. Treasury's trademark filing. The custody relationships with Citibank, BBVA, and DBS through Medico. These are not price events. They are cycle events, the kind that institutional investors track as positioning signals. The trigger that ends the accumulation phase and begins the repricing. Regulatory codification. When the Clarity Act passes and XRP's commodity status becomes federal statute, the compliance gates that have kept the most conservative institutional capital on the sidelines open simultaneously. 65% of surveyed institutional investors citing regulatory clarity as their single constraint, all moving at once into a supply that has been systematically reduced for months. That is not a rally. That is a reclassification event. Now, before you get too excited, There is something about this repricing mechanics that most optimistic XRP analysis ignores. And if you don't understand it, you might react to the repricing exactly the wrong way, even if your thesis is completely correct. The catch is in how institutional capital flows after a major trigger event, and it is not what you think. Stay with me. Here is the nuance that separates the investors who benefit from a repricing from those who experience it but do not capture it. When a regulatory trigger fires and institutional capital deploys simultaneously, the first price move is often followed by a period of volatility, sometimes significant volatility, as the market finds its new equilibrium. Different institutional allocators are entering at different speeds through different products with different risk parameters. Early institutional buyers enter at the repricing level. Later institutional buyers enter higher. Retail FOMO enters at the highest levels, often right before the first consolidation. The investor who understands this structure stays positioned through the volatility that follows the trigger. The investor who does not understand it, who bought the repricing for the right reasons, but sells the subsequent volatility for the wrong ones, exits right before the next leg of institutional deployment drives the next move. This is the exit too early failure mode. Not the failure to see the thesis, not the failure to buy, the failure to hold through the cycle-level noise that always follows a major repricing trigger. David Schwartz, Ripple's CTO, stated it precisely on record. If there were a way to make the price go up faster, he would do it. But the price does not move on developer will or retail enthusiasm. It moves when institutional capital deploys at scale into a constrained supply. That deployment happens on a cycle clock, not a daily chart. Holding through the process is the only way to be positioned when the cycle completes. And that brings us to the piece of the analysis that most channels won't address directly, because it requires explaining why the global financial system's $36 trillion debt problem is not a Bitcoin problem. It is specifically and mathematically a bridge asset problem. And once you see the arithmetic, you cannot unsee it. I want to pause here, because what we just mapped, the narrative versus functional divide, the repricing mechanics, the honest catch about volatility after trigger events, this is the kind of structural analysis that requires running on the cycle clock, reading the infrastructure signals, knowing the difference between a price event and a cycle event. That is what XRP News Flow Signals delivers every week. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the sovereign debt arithmetic I am about to lay out is the final piece of the cycle clock framework. And it explains why the Treasury's policy language pointed to bridge assets rather than store of value assets. You want this in your analytical toolkit before the regulatory trigger fires. Let's close the loop on the macro context, because the $36 trillion sovereign debt number is not just a headline. It is the architectural pressure that is forcing the innovation cycle we are currently inside. When debt reaches historic extremes, systems face three options: inflate it away, restructure it, or innovate out of it. Inflating it away requires currency devaluation, which destroys the purchasing power of every citizen holding that currency. Politically survivable in the short term, structurally corrosive in the long term. Restructuring it requires negotiating with creditors, which for the United States involves the entire global financial system that holds U.S. Treasury bonds as reserve assets. Diplomatically and financially catastrophic. Innovation, specifically, transitioning to programmable digital financial infrastructure that increases the velocity of economic activity, reduces friction costs, and creates new efficiency gains that expand the tax base, is the only viable path at scale. And this is where the bridge asset thesis becomes not just relevant, but mathematically necessary. The U.S. Treasury's 47-page framework named bridge assets with institutional-grade liquidity profiles, because the innovation path requires assets that move value, not store it. In a programmable financial system processing $867 trillion in annual tokenized volume by 2030, the settlement layer needs to operate in seconds at negligible cost across every jurisdiction simultaneously. Bitcoin, designed as a store of value with 60-minute settlement and 7 transactions per second, does not meet that engineering specification. The arithmetic of scaling it to sovereign debt relief levels breaks before it reaches systemic utility. XRP, designed as a bridge asset with 3 to 5 second settlement, 1,500 transactions per second, and negligible transaction costs, meets every specification the innovation path requires. The Treasury knows this. The language in the document reflects it. The institutional infrastructure being assembled through Ripple Prime confirms it. Here is the strategic insight that separates integration from disruption and why it matters for XRP's adoption timeline. Disruption requires replacing existing systems. It creates resistance from the institutions, regulators, and users of those systems. The history of financial technology disruption is littered with products that were technically superior but could not overcome the institutional friction of replacement. Integration requires working with existing systems. It creates alignment with institutions that benefit from the efficiency gains. It accelerates. The history of financial technology integration is full of products that achieved rapid adoption precisely because they did not threaten the existing power structure. They enhanced it. XRP is not replacing SWIFT. It is integrating with SWIFT through Thunes. It is not replacing the DTCC. Ripple Prime is operating as a DTCC participant. It is not replacing prime brokerage. It is becoming a prime broker on XRP rails. Every major institutional adoption path XRP has pursued has been through integration, not disruption. And integration accelerates adoption in a way that disruption never can, because it turns potential opponents into willing partners. Citibank is not threatened by Ripple's custody infrastructure. Citibank is using it. Goldman Sachs is not threatened by XRP ETFs. Goldman Sachs holds them. The DTCC is not threatened by Ripple Prime's FICC membership. The DTCC added Ripple Prime to its operational directory. The system is not being disrupted. It is being upgraded from within. Let me leave you with the frame that makes the entire cycle clock thesis clear. The wealth transfer happening right now in the XRP market is not between bulls and bears. It is between two groups running on completely different clocks. The daily clock shows 8% drops, sideways price action, sentiment at multi-year lows, retail selling. The cycle clock shows exchange reserves at 8-year lows. Ripple Prime integrated into DTCC clearing. $13 trillion in Treasury volume waiting for XRP migration. U.S. Treasury policy language naming bridge assets as the sovereign reserve framework requirement. 65% of institutional investors waiting for one regulatory trigger. The repricing that follows when those two clocks converge is not gradual. It is immediate. And by the time the daily chart makes it obvious, the positioning phase is over. The question is simple. Which clock are you running on? If this cycle clock framework changed how you see your XRP position, subscribe to XRP News Flow Signals before the regulatory trigger synchronizes the clocks. We run on the cycle clock every week before the daily chart catches up. Drop one word below, clock, if the temporal mismatch framing landed as the signal it is. Let's see who is running on the right time horizon. Stay sharp. The signal does not lie. Not financial advice. Always conduct your own research.